In 1998, Codemasters released Colin McRae Rally. Inspired by other rally racing games of the time, the developers wanted to focus on making the mechanics realistic, and both rally driver Colin McRae and his co-driver Nicky Grist provided technical input to that end. The game was a smash hit, so a sequel was all but assured, and sure enough, there was a new Colin McRae Rally game every year from 2000 to 2004. After a 3-year gap without any new Colin McRae games, Codemasters released a sequel called Colin McRae Dirt in 2007. Later that year, Colin McRae died in a helicopter crash, and Codemasters included a tribute to him in Colin McRae Dirt 2 in 2009, and then subsequently dropped his name from the series from Dirt 3 onwards. When asked about why they dropped Colin McRae's name from their games, Codemasters gave a weirdly promotional answer about how the mechanics of their games respect his legacy. Colin's ethos of if in doubt, flat out, drives the way that we design the game. We want players to not think of consequences, to just go as fast as they can. Our flashback tool allows players to do that. If they make a simple mistake, they can quickly rectify that. Okay. That response tastes particularly sour in light of the cause of death investigation that found that Colin McRae was actually at fault for flying recklessly, which is what resulted in the avoidable helicopter crash that also killed his 5-year-old son, his son's 6-year-old friend, and another family friend. Did you know that Ubisoft has literally bought the name Tom Clancy for a one-time fee? And they've used that name for games that have absolutely nothing to do with him. Like, for instance, Tom Clancy's The Division, developed after Tom Clancy's death and not based on anything that he's ever made. I find that kind of ghoulish and dystopian, so I'm glad at least that Codemasters didn't take that route. Anyway, back in 2001, developers Spellbound Entertainment made a Game Boy Color adaptation just called Colin McRae Rally, and over a decade later, Codemasters decided to take a stab at making a mobile game themselves, and the result was 2013's Colin McRae Rally, initially released for iOS, but later ported to Android, OS X, and Windows. And that's how we ended up with 3 games called Colin McRae Rally. So join me as I play these 3 games all called Colin McRae Rally. I'll highlight what makes each one notable, and then determine which deserves to keep its name, and which ones are getting new titles. Let's find out which one comes out on top, as there can be only one Colin McRae Rally. Colin McRae Rally is a rally racing game. You race from one end of the track to the other, trying to beat your opponent's times, and yeah, that's pretty much it. What you see is what you get, really. The game focuses heavily on winding paths, and helpfully you get a navigator who tells you about the upcoming turns. Good thing, too. At first I was having a really hard time getting to grips with the handling. Literally, the wheels are slipping constantly, and it's super easy to accidentally overcorrect, because it feels like the steering is doing nothing at all, right up until the moment that it's doing way too much. The driving here almost feels delayed, like you have to predict what you need to do a few seconds from now, rather than doing what you need to do right now. It's weird. But that's just the first environment, New Zealand, which is very heavy on the mud and the wet gravel. The game features 7 other environments: Greece, Monte Carlo, Australia, Sweden, Corsica, Indonesia, and the UK. In addition to different visuals, each location is also generally themed and features different road surfaces. For example, Sweden is full of snow and ice, while Corsica has you speeding along mountainside roads. And while each track individually tends to be kind of monotone, they actually do a pretty good job of differentiating themselves from each other, even within the same environment. Now I want to talk about the graphics. I kind of hate them. Look, there's no denying that they're pretty dated, and even for 1998, these aren't exactly impressive, but that's not the part I dislike, not at all. I think the aesthetics are actually pretty effective. They do a good job of creating the atmosphere for each environment and setting them apart visually. And while the trees and the crowds and such are all just 2D sprites that are billboarded to always face you, in a way that's kind of all you really need. You spend almost the entire game focusing on the road and moving very quickly in one direction. The exact conditions needed to sell the billboarding effect, and even when you do notice, it gives the game a kind of pleasant, quaint feeling, like you're driving through a pop-up picture book. The part I absolutely cannot stand is the render distance. On tracks with dense forest on tight, winding paths, you'll mostly not notice it, but on the more open maps, it couldn't be more obvious. The world before you just drifts in and out of existence, with the land forming or vanishing and sprites popping in or out before your very eyes. Like, yeah, the graphics and the environments are good. I mean, check out this mountain. Hold on, give it a second. Yeah, see, that's good stuff. So the fact that the game insists on doing this horrendously ugly and distracting pop-in is really disappointing, and that's on the highest render distance. Just look at the lowest. Now I can respect that for a lot of the hardware at the time, this aggressive culling was strictly necessary to even run the game, and that's fine, but it makes me wish that there was an I'm from the future toggle that I could flip to just up the render distance to ridiculous. Or at the very least, I wish they had used some fog to make it less obvious. They even have fog in Sweden, and they still don't use it to disguise the render distance. Anyway, other than that, like I said, I like the graphics. Some of the tracks take place at different times of day, or have fun little landmarks like these cute windmills. And I honestly couldn't tell you why, but I absolutely adore these little stone walls holding the land back. In addition to the championships, the game lets you select any car and track at will to race in, optionally with either split screen or LAN multiplayer. Except actually, not really. In order to select any given car or track, you first have to progress sufficiently far in the championship. Okay, well, that sucks. Like, if you get this game specifically to race against your friend, nope, too bad. One of you has to sit there and play the championship first. On top of that, there are 3 difficulties to the championship, and yep, unlocking everything requires beating the hardest difficulty. The easiest difficulty unlocks only 4 of the 12 cars and only 18 of the 52 tracks, less than 1/3 of the game. You don't even get access to the Indonesia or UK environments without beating the harder difficulties. Making matters worse, the first environment, New Zealand, is, in my opinion, the second most beginner-unfriendly one. Sweden, predictably, is probably the worst, but any of the others would make for a far more approachable introduction to the game. During the championship, you're given time before the tracks to repair and tune your car according to what's coming up. So when you know that the track features some significant straightaways, you might sacrifice acceleration in favor of top speed, stuff like that. On paper, I think this is a really cool idea. Tailoring the car's handling and behavior for the specific track and personal preference is neat, and it helps to make each track feel like an expedition as much as a race. In practice, though, it means that players are going to require a pretty significant amount of time and experimentation to figure out what they want. This game would definitely benefit from a testing ground of sorts, where you can try out different cars and configurations on all the different types of surfaces and weather conditions. As it is, trial and error is a fairly tedious, if kind of necessary, part of the game. Similarly, I think that the time allocation mechanic for doing that tailoring is a nice idea that ultimately falls flat. Like, having to repair the damage that you've inflicted on your car in previous tracks is funny, but also driving a trashed car is not all that different from driving a pristine one. By far the most impactful tuning option is the tire type, which is also by far the cheapest one to change. And on top of that, for the very first race of each rally, you don't have to repair your car, so you can tune the other options to your liking without having to worry about the time cost. So in the end, this system doesn't really ever invite you, much less force you, to make an interesting decision. Also, that acceleration top speed trade-off isn't even half as meaningful as it could have been. The game just inherently favors acceleration given all the twists and turns, so even in tracks that seem to have significant straightaways, only the halfway split between acceleration and top speed was usually the right choice. Overall, the championships are very forgiving. The easiest difficulty is actually super easy, and on top of that, the way that the scoring works kind of inherently benefits the player and gives you a lot of breathing room to make mistakes. Your points are assigned per region, and they're based on your total time for that region overall, meaning that you can make up for lost time in one track by doing better in a different one. On top of that, you're scored against NPC opponents who, as far as I can tell, have somewhat randomized times. They don't finish in the same order across the tracks. This means that you could very feasibly win first place in a region without finishing first place on any of that region's tracks. The same dynamics extend to the championship overall. You don't need first place in each region, you just need the most points by the end. And once again, the point distribution among the NPCs is not fixed, meaning that you could win the championship with second or third or even last place in some regions. When I was playing through on the easiest difficulty, once I won first place in every track in each of the first 4 regions, I was literally unbeatable. Even after I absolutely sucked at Sweden, the second place racer would have had to have gotten first place in the final remaining region, and get double points for some reason, and I'd have to get 0 points, and then they'd only tie. So yeah, I enjoyed my time with the championship, but I wasn't enthusiastic about the idea of playing through another one just to gain access to the remaining cars and tracks. Thankfully, there are cheats. And weirdly, there are several cars and tracks that are only available with cheats. Cheats also give you loads of other options, and while an awful lot of them are just silly gimmicks, like making your navigator's voice high-pitched, some of them are actually really nice, like being able to mirror or reverse tracks, which can add a lot of longevity to the game. So it's kind of strange to me that these are obscured behind cheat codes. Anyway, Indonesia is cool. It's got nice beaches and tropical jungles. The UK as a region is the most diverse, but on the flip side that means that nothing about it is particularly unique compared to the others. So what to make of Colin McRae Rally? I think this is a game that completely holds up, except for that pop-in. That seems like the kind of thing that could be pretty easily hacked, but that's definitely outside of my wheelhouse, so here we are. But the gameplay itself is very solid, and this feels like the kind of game that's really easy to pick up, but has a lot of room for mastering the mechanics. And there's clearly been a lot of effort put into creating the feeling that you're going someplace new and interesting with each track. Colin McRae Rally is a top-down rally racing game. Once again, this game is just exactly what you think it is at first glance. When I first learned that this game would be top-down, I thought that the difference in perspective would make it easier to see upcoming turns, but as you can see, that's not really the case. The camera is very low to the ground, and because it's top-down, you don't get to see very far in front of you. Making matters worse, your navigator is kind of terrible at his job. His instructions are often inaccurate, delivered at inconsistent times, and a lot of them don't even result in a symbol at the top of the screen to help guide you. Also, in case it wasn't obvious, this car is so slippery. It's honestly an absolute blast, and I can't really explain it, but it is so much more fun slipping and sliding all over the place from this perspective. And the little car sprite is so cute. I'm an absolute sucker for 2D sprites that convincingly look like 3D objects, and they absolutely knocked it out of the park here. Look how it tilts during sharp turns. The car is so good, I want to be his friend. I'm less impressed with the environments though. There are places where I'm not really sure what I'm looking at, like, what's going on here? Is that just dirt? I have no idea. The Game Boy Color can only display 56 colors at any given time, but I don't think they picked the right 56 colors. They tend to clash rather than creating a cohesive look. I suspect that part of the problem here is that I'm playing this on a much bigger screen than what the GBC had, and these colors would look less harsh on a smaller display. Yeah, see? But now you can't see the car as easily, so... Another letdown is the game's audio. I didn't mention it, but in the original CMR there was only one song, and it only played in the menu. The rest of the game was just the sounds of your car and your navigator telling you what's coming up.
1 left, across into square right.
It's the same deal here, only the menu song is kind of annoying. And the engine sound is intolerable. Actually, despite playing very differently and from an entirely different perspective, this game is, I think, a sort of port of the original game. It features the same environments, the same cars, and surprisingly, even the same tracks, though there are minor differences owing to how they put them together. And this game similarly requires beating the championship on its harder difficulties to unlock everything, but this time around, I found the championships to be absolutely brutal. And that's only compounded by how uncontrollable the car is. I won the easiest championship, no problem at all, but the intermediate difficulty is just too much for me to handle. Again, I have to kind of question the logic here. I mean, this is a game that you can pick up and play for 3 or 4 minutes on your Game Boy and then put it down. So what's the point of having this linear order of tracks that you're required to play through? I don't even mind that as a game mode. Actually, I think a running championship is a great way of stringing the levels together. But requiring players to do it that way and to perform well enough to even see all the levels is just strange, and it's entirely contrary to the appeal of this kind of game, particularly for a handheld platform. So what to make of Colin McRae Rally? It sits in kind of a weird place for me. On the one hand, I dislike almost all of it. The wonky championship gatekeeping, the audio, the visuals, the tracks themselves, the handling, the navigator. But on the other hand, I don't know, slipping and sliding from this perspective is just plain fun. There are entirely not enough drifting racing games with this perspective. And just look at that little car go! Is this a good game? I'm not sure. Is it charming? Absolutely. Colin McRae Rally is a rally racing game. You race from one end of the track to the other, trying to beat your opponent's times. It looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? So yeah, this game is strikingly similar to the original. So what's different? Most obvious is the difference in graphics. Stylistically, it's very similar. You still get that quaint pop-up picture book feeling, but the resolution on everything is much higher, and you also get real-time lighting and shadows. That sounds nice, but it's actually awful. For one thing, the game still suffers from distant pop-in, not nearly as bad as the original, but it's still there and there's no setting for it. Like, look at this. You can see this bridge fading into existence right in front of you. That bridge isn't even part of the track, it's purely decorative. You'd think that if they were going to add a purely decorative piece of scenery, they'd want it to, not look awful. Also, their frustum culling is just a little too aggressive, and you'll sometimes see trees popping out of existence as you drive past them. The biggest graphical offense, though, is a little more subtle, particularly if you're just watching this game and not actually playing it yourself, and that's those real-time shadows. Now first I want to emphasize that, for me, the most important thing in graphics is to look consistent. Not high quality, not pretty, consistent. That's why screenshots don't really matter to me. Like, yeah, in the original CMR, this screenshot looks pretty nice. But put it in motion and the entire world just appears in front of you, and that's extremely ugly. Similarly, yeah, these shadows here look pretty good. But then you put it into motion, and now you get this extremely ugly scene where the shadows get more detailed. Yuck. And just take a moment to think about where that seam is. This is a racing game. That's the exact point I'm going to be looking at for the vast majority of the time. They're literally shoving this right in my face. I can't just ignore it. There are times when there's enough room for my brain to fill in the blanks and just willfully pretend that it's like a cloud passing overhead or something, but most of the time it is just ugly. And this scene becomes super noticeable in constant shadow, and it's even present in constant light. Come on. And why does this game even have real-time lighting? It doesn't need it, at all. For my money, shadows are probably the most expendable graphical effect. For just about every game I've ever played, at absolute worst, the lack of real-time shadows takes a tiny amount of getting used to, and that's it. Hey, the original game didn't have real-time lighting, and you probably didn't even think about that until just now. What they have instead is baked-in lighting that is computationally way cheaper than real-time lighting, and in my opinion, more effective precisely because it doesn't have this ugly pop-in. They even go the extra mile and make those baked-in shadows darken your car. With modern tech, you could use the same principles and get something that's way better than what this game actually does. The shadows are rendered in real time, but they don't need to be. They don't change. The trees don't move, the sun doesn't move. This could have been baked. Really, the only thing that the real-time lighting gives us is the car's shadow. Who cares? Is that worth sticking the portal to the Shadow Realm right in front of me the entire game? I don't think so. I guess it would be worth taking a moment to talk a little more about how this was originally a mobile game that later got ported to PC. Generally speaking, porting mobile games to PC is a contentious prospect to say the least. Particularly among the PC gaming crowd, there is a tendency to view mobile and browser games as being in some way insufficient or unworthy of being considered real games. And by extension, the people playing mobile and browser games are not real gamers. The thing is, lots of people have phones and/or a computer with a web browser willing to try out a free game that's easily available to them, but not so many people are willing to splurge on an expensive platform, buy an expensive game, and then sit through a long install before even figuring out if the game is any fun. Games being widely accessible is always going to be criticized by gatekeeping jerks, and I think that that's where the vast majority of animosity towards mobile games comes from. Now, there are plenty of valid criticisms that people have levied towards mobile games and web games over the years, but I don't think that really has anything to do with it, because those criticisms aren't even relevant anymore to distinguish the platforms from PC. I mean, it's not hard to imagine how this game would look if it were released today. The tracks would all be procedurally generated, the tournaments would be limited time events, you'd have to buy a tournament pass to even get rewards from it. Those rewards would include toolboxes, which you could open for random car parts. There'd be a rotating store for car parts, you need 100 car parts of a given car to put it together to unlock that car, and you would only be able to do 3 races a day before having to buy more fuel or something. Purchasing the tournament pass, toolboxes, car parts, and more fuel would all be done with an obfuscated currency, rally bucks, that you'd have to buy first. Also, the game would only run on their servers, so if you had a flaky connection, you'd get booted out, and when their servers shut down, the game would be permanently destroyed. Colin McRae Rally doesn't actually do any of that, which is good because all of that garbage would make the game much worse, but also, importantly, much more profitable. The thing is though, as much as those systems are associated with web and mobile games, they're now also all ubiquitous on PC too. Obfuscated currencies are everywhere, battle passes and other limited time events and game modes are everywhere, systems that reward playing on a daily basis are everywhere, absolutely junk player retention progression is everywhere, games that will in all likelihood stop existing within the next decade or so due to their reliance on company servers are everywhere, and there's been a definite trend away from well thought out designs and experiences, and towards endlessly replayable, homogeneous mush. And not only have PC gamers just accepted this garbage, seemingly without any real pushback, but many of them even actively praise or clamor for it. Live service doesn't even have a negative connotation for some reason. The mobile games of yesteryear were real games, alright. More than that, they were pioneers. They set the mold, and PC gaming has largely followed them right off the cliff. Pretending like PC is superior to mobile has never been more clownish behavior. Anyway, back to the game, the graphics are not the only letdown compared to the original. For one thing, the whole car tuning thing is completely gone. You can only repair the damage that you've inflicted to your car. I feel kind of lukewarm about this one, because I don't think the mechanic was really doing much in the original, but its absence is still felt. Like, they still show you the track preview and tell you what surfaces to expect, but you can't actually do anything with that information. This game has only 3 environments, compared to the original's 8. The first environment is Australia, and it's followed by Greece, which is basically just pastel Australia. There are some landmarks like this train track, this big pipe, and like some rocks. But for the most part, the 12 tracks across these first 2 environments don't really differentiate themselves from each other, and there were times during the championship where I incorrectly believed that the tracks were being repeated just because they were so similar. But then they also do actually reuse some of the same tracks across different rallies, though sometimes they have you race the track backwards. I mentioned procedural generation before. I feel like this game would actually have benefited from it because none of these tracks have any personality anyway. The third environment, Corsica, is mostly differentiated by having entirely tarmac tracks. On that note, the original game had a bunch of different surfaces: tarmac, gravel, mud, ice, snow. But this game just has gravel and tarmac, and that's it. You might have noticed that my steering is pretty jerky, particularly for small corrections or the gentler turns. That's because this game does not have analog steering. It's either full turn or no turn, nothing in between. I've been using a controller this whole time. The original game from 1998 handles it just fine. The Game Boy Color game didn't have any analog inputs because, well, it was a Game Boy Color game. They only had a D-pad to work with, no analog stick. Now, reportedly, if you play this game on your phone, you can use tilt controls for analog steering, but I didn't verify that myself, and also that sounds awful. But I'm skeptical that the tilt controls even do actually work, because this game does pretend that it accepts analog input. I mean, I am playing with a controller, it's just that the thumbstick can't actually be used for gradual steering. It's just all or nothing, like I said earlier. The game even features 3 analog-related options: wheel support, controller sensitivity, and dead zone. The dead zone slider works as expected, and I don't really know what wheel support is supposed to do, but I don't have a steering wheel. Turning it on just seems to make me unable to reverse, and that's it. As for controller sensitivity, as far as I can tell, it does literally nothing. I tried it at maximum, at minimum, wheel support on, wheel support off, nothing. It seems like it's just a purely cosmetic slider. As before, you don't need to place first in each individual track in order to win the championship, you just need the best overall time across all the tracks in a given rally. Except now, the NPC opponents do always finish in the same order, giving you significantly less wiggle room. Also, you get assigned medals at the end of each rally, but they don't persist across the rallies, so they're essentially pointless. The navigator is worse too, I think. He tends to give instructions that are simply way too late to do anything about. You have to brake very early and very hard in this game if you want to make it through these turns, so your navigator holding out on you for too long can be pretty disastrous. Also, he'll sometimes just say 1 for no apparent reason.
1.
The physics don't feel quite as intuitive this time around. In the original, there were jumps, and they could cause you to wipe out pretty badly, but if they did, it was pretty much your fault. In this game, getting any air at all runs the risk of being catastrophic. Even hitting jumps head-on will often cause the car to tilt uncontrollably. I've also seen some clips from other players online where they just go flying off the road for seemingly no reason. The final downgrade is the crowds that stand by the road to watch you go by. In the original, they were pretty much only present at the very beginning and end of the tracks, which helped to give the rest of the track the feeling of being out racing in the wilderness, just you and your navigator. In this game, they are everywhere, and they've brought kazoos. Why? They are so annoying. Do people actually do this? Sit around in the middle of nowhere blowing kazoos like there's no tomorrow, just waiting to see a rally car for like 3 seconds as it zooms past them? Oh my god! Alright, so that's what's worse. What's better? Well, once again, there's only one song, and it's in the menus, and it's pretty catchy. So what to make of Colin McRae Rally? I think in basically every way except for the texture resolution, render distance, and menu music, this game is just a straight up downgrade from the original 15 years prior. It's worth mentioning that all of the cars and tracks from this game come from Colin McRae Rally 2.0, but it is not a port or remaster of that game. CMR2 has more tracks, more cars, more music, different handling and physics. It's just a different game. This is more like an in-house asset flip. But despite all these heaps of criticisms, I have to admit that I do find this game rather Moorish. Particularly with the shorter tracks, I found it really easy to play several of them back to back to back. I think the lack of car tuning actually helps here, because you don't really need to think about it or even look at the upcoming tracks at all. You just repair what you can and hit continue. Well, there we have it. We've seen what the Colin McRae Rallies are offering. So, which one is better? This one's easy. The original game is Colin McRae Rally. Look, I'm sorry GBC game, I love your handsome and slippery little car, but locking the bulk of the game behind a championship that I have no hope of winning is just too much. And while I do think that the 2013 game was onto something with a more simplified take on the gameplay, it has so many other minor issues, and the tracks are just so bland that it feels entirely like a downgrade compared to the original. So, what should these games be called? The Game Boy Color game should have been called Lil Cars Slip and Slide Adventure, and the 2013 game should have been called Colin McRae Rally Streamlined. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for, Prey. Another long day of rally racing comes to an end. Can't wait to get home and... Wait, what? Oh, yes! Yes! I'm ready! Oh.